Welcome to Management Unplugged. You've been looking at some fascinating dynamics in your sector, and, well, to really cut through the noise, we're diving deep today. We're tackling one of the most powerful tools in business strategy, Porter's five forces. Now, when you think about what eats into your profitability, your direct competitors probably spring to mind first, right? But what this framework shows us is that the pressures on your bottom line, they actually come from a much wider field than just those guys.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. Keeping tabs on your direct rivals is, well, it's a given, but for you to truly understand where you stand and how to build a really resilient strategy, the Five Forces framework gives you that much bigger picture. It helps you analyze the fundamental structure of your industry and pinpoint exactly what's driving profitability or, the lack of it. We're going to break down five key forces that are either squeezing profit margins across the board or maybe presenting potential avenues for you to gain an advantage.
Okay, so for you listening, these are the levers that really matter. Let's get into it. What's the first force we need to get a handle on?
The first force is rivalry among existing competitors. This looks at just how intense the battle is between the companies already operating in your industry. Think of it as the day-to-day slugfest for customers and market share.
We see this constantly, don't we? Companies locked in price wars or, each trying to outdo the other with new features, or those never-ending marketing blitzes. So what are the telltale signs that this rivalry is particularly fierce in an industry, maybe even your industry?
Yeah, several factors can really crank up the intensity.
Yeah.
If you've got a lot of players in the game, especially if they're all roughly the same size and strength, the competition for each customer becomes a real dog fight. Also, if the overall industry isn't growing very fast, companies are basically forced to try and snatch market share from each other just to expand. That escalates things.
Right. Stealing rather than growing the pie.
Exactly. Another thing to watch for are high exit barriers.
No.
These are factors that make it difficult or costly for a company to leave the industry, like highly specialized equipment that can't be easily repurposed, or maybe a management team that's just stubbornly committed to staying the course. When companies feel trapped, they often become more aggressive competitors.
Okay.
And finally, if your rivals have very ambitious goals for market leadership, or maybe if there's a lack of clear understanding about each other's strategies and intentions, that can also lead to more unpredictable and, frankly, intense rivalry.
So if you see a lot of equally matched players fighting for a slow-growing pie, that's a definite red flag for intense rivalry. And you mentioned this rivalry isn't just about who has the flashiest commercials. What
Right.
other forms does it take, and which ones should you be most concerned about?
Absolutely. While things like advertising and product innovation are definitely part of the competitive landscape, price discounting is a major weapon, and often the most damaging one. When everyone starts slashing prices, the benefit goes straight to your customers,
Yeah.
and your profit margins just get hammered. So for your business, keep a close eye on how frequently and aggressively your competitors are using price as a primary tactic.
Ouch. Price wars really sound like a race to the bottom. When are we most likely to see this kind of, well, cutthroat price competition erupt?
Price competition tends to be most brutal when the products or services being offered are pretty much commodities. Very similar, little differentiation.
Yeah.
And it's easy for your customers to switch from one provider to another with minimal hassle or cost.
Low switching costs. Got it.
Yeah. And high fixed costs, coupled with low marginal costs, can also incentivize companies to lower prices just to keep their production facilities running, near full capacity.
Like airlines trying to fill seats?
Exactly like airlines trying to fill every seat on a flight. Similarly, there's a need for significant upfront investment to expand production capacity. That can sometimes lead to oversupply, and then subsequent price drops as everyone tries to sell off that extra capacity.
Makes sense.
And of course, if you're dealing with perishable goods, whether it's, fresh produce or rapidly aging technology, the pressure to sell quickly, even at a lower price, increases significantly.
Okay, so if your product is largely the same as everyone else's and customers can jump ship easily, you're in a danger zone for price wars. What's a healthier way for companies to compete? Something that doesn't just erode everyone's profits.
Well, competition based on factors other than price. Things like unique features, superior customer service, a strong and trusted brand that's generally much less damaging to overall profitability.
Right.
It's about offering something that your customers value beyond just the absolute lowest price. It's also helpful to think about the difference between what we call zero-sum rivalry and positive-sum rivalry.
Okay.
Zero-sum is where one company's gain directly comes at the expense of another. They're fighting over the same limited pool of customers.
Right, that race to the bottom again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Positive sum, on the other hand, involves companies focusing on serving different customer segments or maybe creating new value propositions that can actually expand the overall market. Consider the commercial aviation industry you mentioned. The intense price rivalry among established carriers on popular routes. That's a classic example of that first zero-sum type of strong competitive force.
Got it. So, understanding not just how many competitors you have, but how they compete is crucial. That's the first piece of the puzzle for you. What's the second force impacting your industry?
The second force is the threat of new entrants. These are those fresh companies looking to muscle their way into your industry. They bring new capacity, often innovative approaches, and, well, a hunger for market share, all of which can put downward pressure on prices, increase your operating costs, and necessitate new investments on your part.
So it's not just about who's playing the game right now, but who could jump in and change everything. And you're saying even the anticipation of new players can have an effect. How does this threat actually limit your profit potential?
Exactly. The very real possibility of new competitors entering your market acts as a kind of cap on how profitable your industry can be. If the threat is high, you might have to keep your prices lower than you'd ideally like, or maybe invest more aggressively in things like R&D or marketing just to build stronger customer loyalty and deter those newcomers. This threat of entry really boils down to what we call barriers to entry, basically. The advantages that established companies, the incumbents, typically have over those looking to break in.
Okay, so what are these barriers? What makes it so tough for a new company to just set up shop and compete effectively? What should you be looking for in your own industry?
There's several key barriers. Supply-side economies of scale are a big one. This is where companies that produce at high volumes achieve lower costs per unit because they can spread their fixed costs, use more efficient tech, or negotiate better deals with suppliers, just due to sheer quantity.
Like Intel.
Exactly. Think about a giant like Intel and microprocessors, or maybe Scott's Miracle-Gro with their massive supply chain and huge advertising budget. A new, smaller player would find it incredibly difficult to match their cost structure.
Right.
Then you have demand-side benefits of scale, often called network effects. Here, the more people who use a product or service, the more valuable it becomes to each user. That makes it very difficult for a newcomer with a smaller user base to compete.
Like eBay.
eBay's online auction platform is a classic example.
Yeah.
The more buyers and sellers on the platform, the more attractive it is for everyone else to join. It creates a virtuous cycle for the incumbent.
That makes perfect sense. The value multiplies with the number of participants. What other hurdles do potential new entrants face?
Customer switching costs represent another significant barrier. These are the fixed costs that your customers would incur if they decided to switch from your company to a new supplier. This could involve things like needing to modify their own products, retrain employees on a new system, or maybe alter established processes. Enterprise resource planning software like SAP as a prime example. Once a company has deeply integrated such a complex system, the cost and disruption of switching are just enormous.
Very sticky.
Very sticky. Capital requirements can also be a major deterrent. Some industries require massive upfront investments just to compete. Manufacturing facilities, large inventories, or even just covering initial losses while building a customer base. Now, while the prospect of attractive returns can often attract financing, the sheer scale of investment needed in certain sectors, like aspiring new airlines needing to buy whole fleets of aircraft, that naturally limits the pool of potential entrants.
So it's not just about having a great idea. Sometimes you need incredibly deep pockets just to get a seat at the table.
Precisely. And beyond just size and scale, established companies often possess incumbency advantages independent of size. This could be proprietary technology protected by patents, maybe preferential access to key raw materials, well-established and trusted brand names built over years.
Location, maybe.
Sure, strategically advantageous geographic locations already secured, or simply the accumulated experience and know-how that comes from being in the industry for a long time. Understanding the nuances. Think about how discount retailers like Target and Walmart, when they were expanding, often deliberately chose locations away from existing department stores.
Ah, smart.
Then there's the challenge of unequal access to distribution channels. A new company needs to get their product to the customer, right? If existing players have already locked up the most effective wholesale or retail channels, it can be incredibly difficult for a newcomer to break through and gain visibility.
Yeah, getting shelf space.
Exactly. Getting shelf space is tough. The rise of low-cost airlines bypassing traditional travel agents and selling direct online is a good example of a strategy to overcome that barrier.
Okay.
Finally, restrictive government policy. Things like stringent licensing, limits on foreign investment, patents, various industry-specific regulations that can directly impede or even entirely prevent new companies from entering a market.
That's a formidable list of potential obstacles for anyone trying to break into an industry. But you also pointed out these barriers aren't absolute. They need to be assessed relative to the capabilities of potential newcomers.
Exactly, yeah. A barrier that might seem insurmountable to a, let's say, small, underfunded startup could be easily overcome by a large, well-capitalized company looking to diversify.
Right.
And the perceived threat of entry isn't just about the height of these barriers, it also heavily depends on the expected reaction or retaliation from the existing players.
How incumbents might fight back.
Right. If potential entrants believe that the incumbents will fight back fiercely, maybe aggressive price cuts, intense marketing campaigns, legal challenges, they might be much more hesitant to enter. This is especially true if the established companies have a strong track record of responding aggressively, possess substantial financial resources to fight back, or if the industry itself is growing slowly, meaning any market share gained by a newcomer comes directly out of the incumbent's pockets.
Okay, that paints a clear picture of why the threat of new entrants can really shape an industry's profitability. Let's move on to the third force, the bargaining power of suppliers. These are the companies that provide you with everything you need to run your business: raw materials, components, specialized services, you name it.
That's right. Powerful suppliers can capture more of the value generated in your industry for themselves. They can charge you higher prices, limit the quality or service they provide, or shift costs onto you in other ways. If you don't have strong negotiating leverage or good alternatives, these powerful suppliers can really squeeze your profit margins.
So what makes a supplier group powerful? What should you be looking at in your supply chain?
Well, a supplier group tends to be powerful if it's more concentrated than the industry it sells to.
Fewer suppliers than buyers.
Exactly. Think about a situation where you have only a few dominant suppliers for a critical component, but numerous smaller companies in your industry buying that component. Microsoft's position with operating systems relative to the many PC manufacturers is a classic example.
Right.
Also, if the supplier doesn't heavily depend on your particular industry for a significant chunk of their revenue, they have less incentive to keep your industry healthy by offering reasonable terms.
They don't need you as much.
They don't need you as much. Another factor is high switching costs for you to change suppliers. If it would be expensive or disruptive for you to find alternative sources, maybe specialized equipment designed for one supplier, or if your facilities are co-located, that gives them significant leverage. Suppliers offering highly differentiated products, perhaps patented ones, or if there are simply no good substitutes for what they provide. Think about skilled airline pilots, represented by a strong union. They also tend to have greater bargaining power. Finally, if a supplier has a credible threat of integrating forward into your industry themselves, basically becoming your direct competitor, that significantly boosts their power in negotiations.
We see that sometimes, don't we? Where a key supplier might think, hey, we could make even more money if we just made the final product ourselves.
Exactly. The commercial airline industry provides a good illustration here, too. The relatively few manufacturers of large commercial aircraft and jet engines, along with, as I mentioned, highly unionized labor forces like pilots, often wield considerable bargaining power over the numerous individual airlines.
All right, so we've examined the existing competition, the potential new players, and the power dynamics with our suppliers. Now let's turn our attention to the fourth force, the bargaining power of buyers, your customers.
Yes, your customers can also exert significant pressure on your profitability. They can drive down your prices by demanding better deals. They can insist on higher quality or more services, which increases your costs. And they can play you off against your competitors to extract even more favorable terms.
As consumers, we all appreciate getting a good deal, naturally, but from a business perspective, this constant pressure can be a real challenge. What makes a customer group powerful? What gives them that negotiating muscle?
Customers gain significant negotiating leverage if there are only a few of them making up a large portion of your sales, or if each individual customer buys in really large volumes relative to your size.
Big accounts.
Big accounts, exactly. This is particularly true in industries with high fixed costs, where the pressure to secure those large orders is intense. If the products or services in your industry are fairly standardized or undifferentiated in the eyes of the buyers, meaning they don't see much difference between you and your competitors, they're much more likely to shop around and push for the lowest price.
They can easily compare.
Easily compare. Low switching costs for buyers also significantly increase their power. If it's easy and inexpensive for them to move to a different supplier, they have less reason to accept your terms. And just like suppliers threatening to integrate forward, if your customers have a credible threat of integrating backward and producing the product or service themselves, perhaps a large retailer considering its own private label goods, they gain substantial leverage. Think about soft drink and beer producers sometimes threatening to make their own cans or bottles.
So a few big customers who don't see much difference between you and your rivals can really call the shots.
That's right.
Okay. What factors make buyers particularly sensitive to price? When are they most likely to drive that hard bargain?
Buyers tend to be much more price sensitive if the product or service you sell them represents a significant portion of their own cost structure or budget.
Makes sense.
Think about consumers shopping for a home mortgage or a small business carefully watching every penny. If your customers are operating on thin profit margins, are facing cash flow issues, or under intense pressure to cut their own costs, they will naturally be very focused on the price they pay you.
Mm-hmm.
Furthermore, if the quality or performance of their own products or services isn't significantly affected by the quality of what you provide, or if your product has little impact on their other operating costs, they will likely be more price sensitive. Conversely, if your product or service can actually improve their performance, reduce their other costs, or enhance their own offerings noticeably, they'll probably be less focused solely on price.
Because there's more value there.
Exactly. Think about specialized software that boosts efficiency for tax accountants, or advanced equipment for oil well logging that saves big money down the line.
That makes a lot of sense. It's all about the perceived value and how much your offering impacts their own bottom line. And you mentioned that these dynamics apply to both individual consumers and B2B customers.
Absolutely. And we also need to consider the power of intermediate customers, entities that buy your product but aren't the final end users. Distributors, wholesalers, retailers.
The middlemen.
Yeah, the middlemen. They can wield considerable influence if they have the ability to significantly impact the purchasing decisions of the downstream customers, the actual end consumers. Consumer electronics retailers, for example, can often dictate which products get prominent shelf space, influencing what consumers ultimately buy.
Right.
Producers often try to counteract this power through strategies like exclusive distribution deals or by investing heavily in marketing directly to the end consumers to build brand loyalty and create pull demand. Like DuPont did with its Stainmaster campaign, they created a consumer demand that retailers then had to respond to.
Interesting. So sometimes you need to go directly to the end user to gain more control in the channel. Okay, we've explored 4 of the 5 forces. That brings us to the final one. The threat of substitute products or services.
Yes, substitutes are products or services that perform the same or a very similar function as what your industry offers, but they do so through a different means or technology.
Like Zoom instead of flying.
Exactly. Video conferencing for business travel, or different materials like plastic substituting for aluminum in some applications, or, email taking the place of traditional express mail.
So it's not just about direct competitors making a similar widget. It's about entirely different ways that customers can meet the same underlying need.
Precisely. And substitutes can be indirect or even emerge from seemingly unrelated industries. For instance, an increase in people choosing multifamily housing instead of single-family homes could be seen as a substitute impacting lawn care services.
I see.
Similarly, streaming services became a major substitute for traditional cable TV. What's crucial to understand is that substitutes might appear very different from your own product. For someone looking for a Father's Day gift, maybe a new necktie and a power tool could both be seen as substitutes, right? Depending on the dad.
True.
Even the option of simply doing without a particular product, buying a used version, or deciding to do it yourself can act as a substitute in certain situations.
So the availability of good substitutes effectively puts a ceiling on how much you can charge. If there's a readily available and affordable alternative, you just can't push your prices too high.
Precisely. A strong threat of substitutes limits your industry's overall profit potential by placing that natural cap on prices. If you don't effectively differentiate your offering through better performance, unique features, strong branding, whatever, you'll inevitably face pressure on your profitability and growth from these alternatives. The threat of a substitute is particularly high if it offers an attractive price-performance trade-off compared to your product.
Like cheap internet phone calls versus old long distance.
Perfect example. The rapid growth of inexpensive internet-based phone services significantly impacted traditional long-distance companies. Similarly, online video rental and streaming crushed physical video stores. The other key factor is the buyer's cost of switching to that alternative. If it's easy and inexpensive for customers to switch, like moving from a brand-name drug to a generic equivalent, the threat is much higher. So as a business strategist, it's vital to be constantly aware of developments in other seemingly unrelated industries that could suddenly create new, compelling substitutes due to tech advances or shifts in consumer behavior.
This has been an incredibly valuable breakdown of Porter's five forces. Really clear. Now that we understand each of these five pressures, rivalry, new entrants, supplier power, buyer power, and substitutes, how can a business, your business, actually put this framework to use to develop strategies?
Okay, so understanding these five forces gives you this powerful lens to assess your industry structure and, crucially, to position your company for better profits and less vulnerability. There are essentially three key ways you can leverage this framework for strategy. First, you can actively try to position your company where the competitive forces are weakest.
Find the easier spots.
Kind of. The example of PACCAR in the heavy truck industry is great here. They deliberately focused on owner-operators, a customer group where buyer power and price rivalry were less intense compared to, say, large fleet operators. And then they meticulously tailored their whole value chain, luxury features, customization, resale values, strong support specifically for this less price-sensitive customer.
So instead of just fighting head-on in the toughest parts of the market, you find and cultivate niches where the pressures are less severe. Smart.
Exactly. The second strategic approach is to be constantly vigilant and ready for exploiting changes in the forces. Think about Apple and digital music. They saw the record labels hesitating with digital distribution and created that seamless iTunes upon ecosystem, completely reshaping how music was bought and consumed.
Timing was key.
Absolutely. And what's insightful there is that the main barrier to entry wasn't physical distribution anymore. It was more about risk pooling for new artists and cutting through marketing clutter areas where labels still had clout. Apple saw that shift and moved decisively.
So it's about staying ahead of the curve, anticipating how these forces might evolve, and being ready to jump on opportunities. What's the third way to use this strategically?
The third crucial strategy is to actively work towards reshaping the forces in your favor. This means using tactics and initiatives aimed at reducing the share of profits leaking out to other players.
Actively changing the game.
Yes. For example, you might try to neutralize supplier power by standardizing components so you can easily switch vendors, giving you more leverage. Or counter buyer power by adding value-added services, making it more costly or inconvenient for them to switch away from you.
Making yourself stickier.
Exactly. You can try to temper price wars by investing in real differentiation that commands a premium. To deter entrants, maybe strategies that raise the fixed costs of competing, making it pricier for newcomers, and limit substitutes by continually improving your own offering's value and accessibility. Think about soft drink producers using vending machines everywhere that boosts accessibility. Or Cisco's efforts in the fragmented food service distribution industry, introducing private labels, value-added services, investing in infrastructure that shows how a big player can proactively improve the industry structure. Now, it's important to recognize that while initiatives that strengthen the overall industry structure can benefit everyone, the company leading the charge often gains the most. But there's a caution here. Companies must be careful not to take actions that inadvertently undermine the industry's long-term health. Some argue IBM's open PC architecture ultimately did that, empowering suppliers and intensifying price wars.
So it's not just about passively reacting to these forces. You can actively try to mold them to your benefit, but you need to be careful about the long-term consequences.
Precisely. And while the strategy of expanding the overall profit pool, increasing demand, reducing collective costs is another important goal, the five forces will still determine how that bigger pie gets divided. Finally, the five forces framework is also invaluable for just clearly defining the boundaries of the relevant industry you're actually competing in. By analyzing how similar these forces are for different products or geographic areas, you get a much clearer picture of your true competitive landscape.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into Porter's five forces. It's really clear now for you listening that understanding competition goes way, way beyond just keeping an eye on your direct rivals. By systematically analyzing these five forces, you can identify the real threats and opportunities in your industry, position your business strategically, and maybe even take steps to reshape the competitive landscape to your advantage.
That's the core message, really. It's about getting a fundamental understanding of the underlying dynamics shaping your industry, not just reacting to the day-to-day competitive noise.
Absolutely. And on that powerful note, it really underscores the idea that strategy starts with knowing the game you're in. Take some time to consider how these five forces are playing out in your own industries or areas of interest. It's a framework that really makes you think about the bigger picture. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.